This is the Hoff Time Report with Idaho Freedom Foundation President Wayne Hoffman, one of Idaho's most respected, influential public policy voices.
Welcome to the Hoff Time Report. It's good to be back, and we have a special guest today. It's Lance Clow, the chairman of the House Education Committee, who hails from Twin Falls. Good to have you here. Welcome.
Well, thank you. This is my first time blogging with you.
Well, mine too. Well, we're glad to have you here because this is a really incredible year in terms of education policy, and there's so many things to cover. Where are you right now when it comes to this year versus other years? Because it just seems like between the K-12 education system and the higher education system, between COVID and the new federal administration, with the Blaine Amendment being discharged, if you will, by the U.S. Supreme Court, there's a lot of stuff happening.
Yeah. Well, you're right. There's a lot of things going on. There's a lot of differences this year because of COVID, a lot of differences because of all the federal money that's poured into the state. And where do we go? What directions do we go? A lot of it, the decisions have been made outside our control. You know, we had the extraordinary session this year. There was about 4 or 5 topics that we wanted to be covered in the extraordinary session, and they didn't get on the agenda. So House Education has to look at those issues and say, do we need to readdress those this year? Issues like who has control of closing of schools, for example. Do we give flexibility to school districts with their budgets if there's a holdback in an emergency? Those are some good examples of types of things. The Blaine Amendment, that has been something I've focused on a lot. And we say the Blaine Amendment, but what we're talking about is the prohibition of using state funds on any religious purpose. It doesn't matter, schools or whatever, and that's primarily what it impacts. And the Espinoza case in Montana focused on a scholarship granting organization and how they had set up the law. The legislature actually set up a law that said that a scholarship granting organization could get tax credits for their donors, and those monies could be then distributed out through their organization as scholarships. But then the Department of Revenue interpreted their Blaine amendments that you couldn't do that with any religious affiliated school. And so that's what triggered this lawsuit. And now the state, I should say the U.S. Supreme Court has ruled that at least in that example, if you're giving choices to people, you can't give them a choice and say, yeah, but you can't use it for religious purposes. And so that's opened up some things that we've wanted to get accomplished for a long time. And budgets could be the biggest constraint on getting that going too far. But I see us doing something along the lines of scholarship granting organizations, education savings accounts, a continuation of the Strong Families, Strong Students program and expanding that in some manner. So I see us doing something. I hope we get something done.
I'm glad you're starting with that because this is something that I don't know if you know, a dear friend of mine named Morris Clements, he was in the legislature in the 1970s, and he brought a voucher bill when he was in the legislature. And, of course, everyone said, oh, you can't do that, Blaine Amendment, and so on. So for the first time, and, of course, we've seen other iterations over many years. There's been tuition tax credits. There have been scholarship programs. And now we have an ESA program that the governor put in place with the coronavirus money. This seems like the perfect year. What are the obstacles to getting some kind of ESA, a big, broad ESA done?
Well, you know, you're narrowing down to ESA, and that's where I've leaned most of the time. But there are competing opinions about how to get there. And so what you have to do is get a coalition of people that want to get something done and have them all agree to something so we're not pulling in different directions. And for example, the scholarship granting organization, that was introduced, I think, in 2018 the first time. And then it got routed to rev and tax because it has to do with tax credits. And it was out a year or so ago, and then a year or so ago we introduced the education savings account, and that was before the Espinoza decision had been made. I have been talking to people to say, look at the bill from, I think it's House Bill 253 from 2019 that Ron Mendive worked on. I said, it's got a lot of the really good language necessary to get something done for an ESA and start from there. But then the Strong Families, Strong Students program came out this summer using COVID-type money, And that seemed to be very popular, and people are leaning towards, well, maybe that's a different way we can help students.
It's very popular. Well, yeah, 30,000 families that are on the program, or 30,000 kids. I'm trying to remember the exact.
I don't know the exact number, but it's like $35 million. So I don't.
So it's a lot of money.
Yeah.
So now the existing system wants to protect its market share, if you will. To what degree is that going to factor in? What degree do you look at the existing public education system and then the people that want to maybe do something else with the money that would otherwise go to public schools? They want to do tutors or private schools or online or whatever it may be.
Well, Wayne, I'll try and answer it two ways. One is we have a constitutional requirement to provide free, thorough, common schools in Idaho. And that's what we've been attempting to do. So most people would argue, are we overfunding that? Is it too much, too little, whatever? So there's $2 billion being spent roughly in public education. So we still have that responsibility. But what the Espinoza case did is says, but you now may be able to do something beyond that. So the balance will be trying to make sure whatever we do is kind of fair and equitable, and they're meeting both charges, both requirements. So if you can take, for example, and look at a student and say, okay, this student's in a public school right now, Boise High School, Twin Falls High School, and they want to go to a private school. Mm-hmm. And if you move that student from a public school to a private school, theoretically the expense cost of that student goes with it. And so therefore should the funding follow that? That's the question. Should the funding follow that student? And the private sector doesn't have enough seats to take everybody, so there'll be some form of natural competitive barriers to move too many kids all at once. But the question would be would we have enough money to do that? Well, theoretically, you could take 30,000 or 50,000 students out of the public school system and put them in private schools, but they can't handle it. They can't handle that number. But the point is that lowers the cost on the state when that happens. The biggest challenge will be to broaden this up so much that the 30,000 private school students that are already out there, they suddenly qualify for all this money. And where would you get that money? You know, that would be a huge budget hit if we did that. I see us somehow phasing in that. Maybe you start with kindergarten and work your way up from year to year. But it's not a simple answer, and that's what everyone's struggling with, is what direction to go and where do we get the money to do it. But the people that are concerned about the student leaving the public school and going to the private school, it shouldn't be about control of the student or worrying about that the public schools are going to be hurt, as long as we retain the funding for all the other students. And I can see that there could be actually a higher average per pupil in the public schools after a student leaves than before. And so I get into the numbers a little bit more. And I'm going to make up a number here. If we have $7,000 that we're spending on public school students from the state level, and we send $5,000 to follow the student, well, there's still $2,000 remaining to maybe make the public school system slightly better, at least keep it whole.
But to be clear, though, it sounds like you're a big fan of the idea that, you know, if a student wants to go to a different school because it better suits their needs, it could be they're going to a public school, they might want to go to Bishop Kelly, or they might want to do some kind of online education, or they want to go to one of these new learning pods, that you'd be favorable to. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it sounds like you'd be favorable to the idea that they'd be able to take that money in some kind of capacity and shop around.
Yeah, I will say up front, the learning pods idea, I don't have a problem with it, but I don't understand it either. How you would fund it, who gets the money? You're just going to send money to mom and dad to homeschool? We do know that the homeschool network, and I think there's several of them, but one of the bigger ones is not very favorable to funding homeschool.
Right.
And but that doesn't mean that all homeschool parents wouldn't welcome some form of money. For example, you could have parents, hopefully they're active in their child's education, that have a special needs child. And they might even want to homeschool that child, but they probably feel they need some of these specialty services that are offered in the public schools through Medicaid or just through special education programs, or hearing, speech impediments, things like that they can get in the schools. Well, maybe we should find ways that if someone wants to homeschool their child, that we give them enough money they can take care of those services and still homeschool. So it's kind of a balancing act of where do you go with those things.
What are the other reforms that you're looking at for the K-12 public education system, given what happened in 2020 with the Rona?
With what?
I call it the Rona, the coronavirus,
The Rona, okay.
COVID-19.
COVID-19. As far as major changes, I hope that we don't have to make anything long-term major, but we've seen a systematic change in the way that kids are educated. Either by accident, maybe it was a good thing, maybe it was a bad thing, whatever, but obviously technology has taken a much bigger lead with all the virtual learning that kids have been going through. And I see a lot more of that type of learning in the future. That may not be what every parent wants. I see that we need to make sure the parents have a choice. Do I want my child to be virtually taught? Do I want my child to be taught in the classroom? And I think we have to make sure that both options can be available, especially if schools are considering shutting down to some level, as we've seen. But the in-school option needs to be always out there, I believe. As far as the overall philosophy of how we get there, I will say this, is I know that teachers have been working their tails off trying to do both. Have a classroom of 25 or 30 kids, and half of them are home and half of them are in the classroom, and trying to prepare different kind of work settings for each of them, dealing with, it's almost like running two different classrooms. The curriculum may be somewhat the same, but how you deliver it and how you determine is the student really engaged is a challenge. So I see us trying to deal with things like how do we count attendance. We've already been working towards an enrollment model. And the enrollment model originally, in my opinion, this goes back almost, I picked up on this as a numbers guy quite a few years ago. People said, well, we need to do enrollment because if we have 30 kids, we have to have 30 seats, we have to have enough teachers for 30 kids, et cetera. And everybody said, we're not getting paid for the 3% of the kids that aren't coming to school every day, or the 4% because of attendance issues. And with that, I said, well, really all they want is more money. It really always boiled down to money. But enrollment gives us some flexibility to say, well, is the student actually involved with his own education, even though he's doing this online, versus being in the seat? It's almost like mastery education. We have kids that are in programs around the state. We had a report today. There's 102 schools around the state are involved with this mastery education network. And those kids move on as they master a topic. Well, it can be somewhat the same with virtual learning. And but how do you count how many kids are involved with their education? And the enrollment model this year, which was adopted by temporary rule, has determined that we had a lot of kids engaged in education this year, maybe not as deep as we think, but engaged that actually were more than the actual attendance. The attendance was way down because kids were held home, schools were closed, all those things. But even though they gave a lot of kids full credit for grades and all these things, some of the attendance numbers are down. But when they looked at it enrollment and they adopted the enrollment model for this year, to say, well, the kid isn't in the classroom, but they are learning. They are engaged in their virtual learning. They're turning in their homework assignments, et cetera. And those numbers came in higher, actually, than what they expected on attendance. So,
I can't help though but wonder if this whole thing, the thing that we're dealing with right now with virtual versus in-person learning, exposes a reality of the modern education system, which is for some kids the online learning works, for some it doesn't. They're all unique, and you can't. And maybe it is for a certain class it works, and maybe for a different class it doesn't work. I kind of always wondered why, when my son was in high school in Nampa, why they put him on a school bus, and the school bus takes him to the building, and he gets off the school bus and he gets on a different school bus to take him to a different school so he can spend an hour in the Spanish class for 3 days a week. That always seemed extraordinarily strange to me, and I wonder if maybe there's more to this than just the usual enrollment versus ADA versus some other mechanism, the partial or fractional ADA, that is more or less the entire function of how the public education system has worked for the last 60, 70 years is being called into question.
Well, it's just like how the telephone worked 30 years ago.
Right. I mean,
things have changed.
Has this accelerated that conversation about maybe the public school system shouldn't revolve around a yellow school bus driving people to and fro for every single student?
Well, it's a good point. And, tomorrow, I'm going to give you a glimpse. There's an RS coming forward to the Education Committee that deals with the fact that thousands of kids flooded into the virtual schools this year.
And Idaho School District has a big virtual school program.
But I'm talking about the true virtuals. I mean, 100% virtual.
Okay, like
Idaho Virtual Academy,
uh-huh.
Inspire Connections,
Mm-hmm.
and these are kids that most of them, I would assume, were in a traditional public school previously. Mm-hmm. But there was a law put in place in 2005 that says no virtual school, no charter school, because these virtual schools are charter schools, could increase their support units by more than 30. Well, the reality is it came in about 70 more support units than expected. Now, these kids would have been in the traditional public schools. Right. So will these parents find out that, hey, this is an interesting way to do it? Before, and this is not a slam, I hope the Idaho Virtual Academy and Inspire Connections doesn't take it wrong, but there was a time when, some parents just wanted their kids online, but there were some kids that had trouble in the regular classrooms. They were looking for some different way to handle this. The attendance in the virtual schools had a tendency to spike or peak, I should say, probably about March, whereas attendance peaks in traditional public schools in about November. And the reason is as kids would struggle in the regular classroom, they would evolve to the virtual classroom. And some of them were behind already, so trying to compare academics to the two different school models right now would be difficult. But I think we're going to find parents of thousands of kids to rethink, well, maybe we'll just continue to do this in the virtual model. And that's kind of what you're saying. Have we gotten away from the traditional bus? Virtual schools, which is interesting, I learned this early in my career, virtual schools get busing money.
That's right.
They get student transportation money. And they can use that to help pay for the internet connections and the computers.
Yes.
So they're not using the yellow bus, as you referenced, to get kids around. Right. So there's a lot of ways.
That was shoehorned into the funding formula about 15 years ago because the argument was being made that the arguments that the charter schools, that these virtual schools, they're not getting transportation money. They don't have the expenditures, but they still have all the wires and the tablets and computers and all this other stuff.
Well, one of the things, my first reaction was, wow, so we're giving them money. They buy computers for all their kids, but we don't buy computers for all the kids in the traditional public schools, right? But the virtual schools, absolutely need a computer.
You kind of have to have those.
Yeah.
But let me ask you some other, because I don't want to spend too much time on that. But you mentioned a governance issue a bit ago relative to who gets to decide whether a school is shut down or whether mask orders are put in place. So what is the answer to that question? Is the school board in charge of that? Did they get to make the decision, or the public health district? In your view, where should that authority be?
I think the basic answer is it should be with the school board. And these public health districts cover more than one district. They cover more than one county. And early in the COVID crisis back in March, there were counties around the state that had 0 cases reported, and yet their schools were being forced to be shut down by health districts. And that's been changing some. But then on the other hand, you have the opposite. What should the school board do? They should take the information that's provided, show the risk. What is the issue? Right now it's COVID, but I don't know what other.
Could be anything,
it could be tuberculosis
but it's
again.
their decision.
Yeah, right.
Do the school boards want that power?
Yeah. Well, yes and no. I think they want it, but then sometimes they exercise it, and then they find out that they've gone too far, and the parents are unhappy. So if they shut down the schools, then you may have parents that say, I want my kid in school, and we've seen that happen. And so I believe that the local board should have the final say on that. They should be getting the information from the health districts as far as recommendations. Everybody should share all that information, but let them make the decision. But I do believe that the school's bottom line should be, I can't imagine a better case, but they should try to find a way to allow the parents to have their kids in school. Because kids need that social interaction as much as they do the academics. Because we're talking about kids growing up. They're growing up socially, mentally, and academically, and the school environment is how they do it. If everybody just was virtually taught, they wouldn't know how to deal with one another. So I think most parents, I think, want their kids in school, and I think most parents learned they are not too excited about doing homeschooling.
Well, I mean, some have. I mean, also, we did have people knowing how to interact with people before the existence of the public education system. So, I mean, it's a bit much to say that people wouldn't know how to interact with one another. But we'll let that go. But
population density may have been different back when you're talking about.
What do we do with regard to what happened with the West Ada School District, for example, that wanted to be back open? The union pushed back quite a bit and ended up doing a sick-out in order to control the dynamics of that reopening plan they had over in Meridian.
Well, I'm not an expert on everything that happened there, but what I understand, several things contributed to that. What I understand is the school board was looking at how do we deal with special ed and full-time students. They thought they couldn't handle special ed, so to be equal to everybody, they shut down their schools. That was part of it. And then there was a sick out, which I thought was wrong. And I guess that's a simple way to say it. I think that was wrong for them to do that. I think they put a black eye on their local union there. And I think a lot of parents reacted against that. And I think a lot of parents in West Ada also put their kids in some of these virtual schools. Right. So,
but the union ended up having as much say in what was happening in terms of the operational decisions of the school as the school board did in that case, because of their willingness to pull the pin on that grenade and throw it in the room, where basically they said, we're just going to have a sick out.
Yeah. And in history, unions or no unions, pre-unions, before unions were organized, employees found that they had some power by not showing up. And whether or not it's because there was a union or they didn't show up, I thought that their sick out was wrong. I've said that. And I don't know simply how to tell you that they shouldn't have done that, but they did. And the results are kind of on the record. And like I said, I think that the school board and in their own ways got a black eye. I think that the union got a black eye, and the parents aren't happy with either group.
And all that is true, but in a private setting, if I have employees that don't show up, I fire them. In the public setting in Idaho, if they don't show up, they get to come back and negotiate at the bargaining table again, because the law requires that the school board negotiate with the union. There's no penalty for bad behavior. Isn't that something the legislature could fix?
Well, in the private sector, we are not the private sector.
Right.
Keep that in mind. And things have been placed in motion way before you and I were ever born about private sector and the public sector, and laws that protect public employees in all sorts of industries. But yeah, you could. But then you get down to, I guess the best example where that happened is when Ronald Reagan fired all the air controllers. I don't know if he fired all of them or how that worked, but what was that, back in the 80s?
In the 80s.
And when the air controllers were threatening to strike or whatever, and he just fired them. But I don't know how I don't know actually how it ended up replacing. But so if the school district fires all the teachers, as you said, then you have the kids with no teachers.
No. I'm not calling for the school board to fire all the teachers. But what I'm saying is the union has no consequence for bad behavior, because the state law says they have to negotiate with the union. But there are plenty of states where they're not required to negotiate with the union. There's some states where collective bargaining is just outright banned. So you talked about the local school board having the ability to make the decisions on whether to close a school or wear masks or whatever, but they don't have the ability to make a decision on whether or not to negotiate with the union because the law compels them to.
Well, the negotiations happened previous, but I'm not sure in that situation where their contracts may have been violated, what powers they had to terminate employees. The negotiations for their contract, I'm sure, happened last, July, August. So I don't know how that all fits together. I'm not going to pretend to know.
No, but fair enough. But my point, though, is, and this is what I'm wondering about, is you have a state law that doesn't compel any kind of good behavior on the part of the union. If they misbehave, the school board still has to negotiate. They have no choice, and it doesn't have to be that way.
And I guess you could argue that a school board could misbehave if they had the right characters on there, and the only way you get rid of them is a recall election, things like that. But
I mean, the school board doesn't have to negotiate with the parents or with taxpayers generally. But the only law that requires them to negotiate with anybody is the law regarding collective bargaining.
Yeah, I don't know.
It just seems like an easy thing to fix. I don't know.
Well, I know you think there's one word that we can change.
I do. I think that you should change that word. You're not willing to.
Yeah. Well, I said I'm not willing to introduce it at this point in time, right?
Not even willing to have a conversation about changing it. And by the way, for those who don't know what we're talking about, Idaho law says the school board shall negotiate with the union. We've said it would be perfectly reasonable to say the school board may negotiate with the union, and then at least they'd have an option, and maybe that would create. But I don't know, for some reason, school boards, they want the control when they want the control, and then we want that local control. But in this case, we don't believe in local control.
Well, and some schools, I would imagine they would feel very comfortable not negotiating with the union. But I don't know what the reaction would be as if you ended up negotiating with every, what would the staff requirements and time requirements if you had to negotiate with every employee?
And certainly there are school districts that do it. Melba comes to mind. They haven't had a teachers union there, and I don't know if they've ever had one there. But somehow they managed to get it done.
We'll have to ask Mr. Grover.
We'll have to ask him. Yeah, maybe he'll have some insights. Okay. Well, anything else on the K-12 side that we haven't covered that you want to?
I'm sure there's a lot of things.
There's always some. Oh, we haven't talked about Common Core. Last legislative session, you made some progress in saying, you know what, maybe we ought to do something different. There's been an interim committee that's been working on it for a while. What are we going to see happen this year? The thing that kind of concerns me is the pace at which this happens. So you put in place Common Core in 2010, and then you get to 2021, 2022, and maybe you'll go ahead and do something differently, and an entire generation of school kids has graduated by that point. What are we doing? How much longer will it take?
Wayne, this isn't Common Core math, and 2 years isn't a full generation.
But 12 years is for a generation of school kids is what I'm talking about.
We adopted the Common Core model in, I think, 2009 or 10. I think it came into place in 2010.
Yeah.
So 2011, I'm giving a signal. I guess one finger up side by side is 11.
It's 11. Okay, good.
Because he can't hold
or
it
a touchdown. We're not
it's
sure.
Either
one
10
of those.
or 1. But 2011, and it took 2 or 3 years before it really got into play. And my biggest problem with the change is I want to make sure that we have some form of standards in place to replace. That's what the whole idea last year was, setting up a letter, giving instructions to the State Board of Education, State Department, and the Governor's Office that we want to move away from the traditional, what you want to call Common Core, and also science. Science is not Common Core, but it was the next generation science standards. And they've been under criticism also, primarily because of some really specific things in their standards. Common Core is the teaching methodology and the curriculum that came about with that, as far as math and math and English language. But to have a motion or a bill that says we're out, every school district has to go in different directions. We have to have some accountability. Our Constitution says we have to have a thorough education. So how are we going to do that if we don't at least give some thoroughness standards for our schools to follow? Here's the money. Do whatever you want.
Well, no, but I mean, you'd think that somehow market forces would come into play. If there's a school that we hear this all the time. Here's a school that's doing really wonderful things. They have super high standards. I want to send my kid to that school. And the issue that I've always had with Common Core is, it's all the same. Every school is basically the same. They play in changes around the edges, but that's about it. It's nothing so dramatic and grand that you can say, yeah, that school, but not that school.
Yeah. Well,
no one's you don't have a public school, I guess. Maybe there's one that has a classical education, except for the charter schools, for example. Yeah. You have to go to a charter school, and then in that case, you have to win the lottery to get in.
Well, I'm not sure about winning the lottery, but the charter schools, and I have my daughter teaches in a charter school. Two of my two granddaughters are in a charter school. I think they do wonderful things. They use a classical education, and I think they pretty much say, we follow that education model. We follow this curriculum. We're going to exceed all the standards. And I'm not going to put words in their mouths because I don't know how they would react to that. But I would almost say that they just know that their curriculum is going to meet all the standards that are put out by almost anybody. And so therefore, they just move ahead. And the new school, as I understand it, I went out and met with, his last name's escaped me, Colonel Steve at Treasure Valley Classical Academy in Fruitland, and they follow.
Oh, right. Mm-hmm. They use the Hillsdale College system.
Yeah,
right?
They use the Hillsdale College system. Yeah. And I said, well, how do you feel about the state standards? I don't worry about them. I know we're going to exceed that. Our kids are going to come out, be able to pass all the tests necessary, so we're not going to get hung up about, what is that standard, and I have to make sure they cover that. They just know that the curriculum and things that they've identified. And I've actually said to a legislator last year that's from a small community, I said, you ought to go to your school district and just tell them they ought to follow that same model and not worry about what the standards are, because you're going to get your kids educated and be more of a classical style.
Well, I mean, if that's the case, then are we having the wrong conversation about Common Core and education standards? Because that is, for some, the floor, and for some, the ceiling. But really what we want is we want an experience that's best for every student. Well, the best you can possibly give them.
You will probably disagree with this, but I can tell you in all honesty, all the people in my district that have come to me and said they want to get rid of Common Core, I said, can you identify the specific standards, give me some examples of exactly what it is that's disturbing to you? And they don't come back. It's this general philosophy that they hear about what's wrong with it. Now, it doesn't mean that there's not something wrong with the idea of the Common Core. If anything, it's not popular enough with the families, so I say we should get rid of it just for that reason alone. But the standards themselves that we're working on, and we gave this message last year, and last March, April, the State Board of Education, State Department started building subcommittees to look at the English language arts, the math, and the science standards, to start going through them and saying, what do we need? Do we have what do we like? Look at different states and build that up. And we are at the point where when this legislative session is over, because all those committees are on hold, they will start public comment to see what the public feels about these new draft standards. And then I imagine next summer we're going to be getting back together with all these committees to try and work forward to say that, we're no longer following the Common Core as such, and their amendments or any revisions that come out from that.
But it's a glacial pace. And I guess the question I would ask you, you're the chairman of the Education Committee in the House, are today's K through 12 public school students getting the very best education that they could possibly get? Are they receiving the world's best, world-class education in the current system, Common Core or no?
Okay, let me ask you this. If tomorrow I waved the magic wand and we had Hoffman standards, how long would it take before the education system, the curriculum, everything catches up to the Hoffman standards?
Well, I mean, it would take less than 12 years, I can tell you that.
Well, but we're not talking about, don't burden me with something that started years ago. We're talking about what are we going to do tomorrow? What are we going to do today? And I'm saying we can make the change. We can make this. It may take a year or two to get it done. It takes years to get standards in place. And one of the critiques of the Common Core early on, and it's gone away now, is that it was never tested in schools. It just came out, and they put it out there, and they made all our kids and teachers have to do this. Well, you're kind of advocating, let's throw it out and start over with something that's never been tested. And I'm saying we need to be a little more thorough, a little more logical to get there. I don't have a problem with moving in that direction. And I think we've accomplished a lot in this past year. Okay. My initial feeling was last year there were motions that were made to just throw out Common Core, and I opposed it only because there was no path in place to what do we replace it with. And not even Florida threw out theirs without starting a process to come up with their best standards and implement it. And it took them over a year to come out with their best standards. And we started this last April to get started, and we're getting close.
I mean, we used to not have centralized government-imposed standards. That's only a very recent phenomenon, only within the last 20, 30 years.
I think it goes back to the 70s. But
so I mean, but the point is that we have at one point in time managed. I guess the question that I would ask, we really need to get off the K-12 is I want to talk about higher education, but I don't know, is the education system today with all of our standards and all of our bells and whistles and computers and online and all these other things better than it was in the 1920s? I don't know. You tell me.
I'll tell you that what was going on in the 20s and what people needed to know is different than what they need to know today. But it's also interesting. They needed to know fine math skills in school, and now they can they're smart. They can look on their phone and get most of their answers. Is that good or is that bad? They still should know the principles of that. People talk about the time it takes. And just the learning process alone for kids. I'm going to talk about math for a second. The kids today are learning math, and it's different than what I learned as a kid. When I was a kid quite a few years before you were a kid. But when I was a kid, the basic simple math standards and stuff. So people get critical. They say, "Well, they're teaching my kid to do division this strange way," And I think what they're trying to do is prepare kids to be able to understand the technology of the future, programming. There was a radio show in my first year in the legislature. I was driving home, and they were talking about some parent calls into this radio show and says, "You know what they're teaching my kid in school? 7 + 6 is 10. And I know, Wayne, what is 7 + 6?
I think it's 13, but
not if you're in a base of 13.
Okay, right. We're going to do this, right? We're going to change base architecture.
But the point is, we don't know what was going on in that classroom that day, because at Micron,
it could have been something else entirely.
In Micron, what is 1 + 1?
Well, I mean, I hope it would be 2, but
no, it's 10 because they're in a decimal system. The binary system of computers is different. So our kids need to understand. So I don't know what was happening in that classroom, but we need to understand when parents get stuff at home, they're teaching kids some different ways of looking at things, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're trying to say you can't divide the old way.
Okay. Well, we could talk about that all day, and I really want to talk about higher education, and we're running out of time. Yeah. So just really quickly. So very recently, the university presidents came out and said, if you pass the budget exactly as the governor proposed it, we'll not raise fees and tuition on students. And I was marveled at that statement. I wondered what your response was to it, and reminding them that, you also have the power to say no increase in tuition and fees if you wanted to.
Well, when I first heard, the no increase in tuition and fees, and if we get the budget as presented by the governor, my first reaction is that, don't tie the two together. One should be independent of the other. I mean, we're either doing something to keep education costs lower, and the technicality of all of that statement is more complex than just, that the budget that the governor recommended restored all the monies from the prior year, I guess, and plus some additional funds. And when I first saw that, I didn't have those numbers in front of me. But
it just seems like a bit much for them to be telling you that, especially given the fact that you could easily pass a bill, or you could have an appropriation bill that says tuition and fees are going to be exactly what they were last year. And why wouldn't you do that?
Well, not being on JFAC, I don't know all their powers, but I imagine within the legislature, there are things that we could do like that. On the other hand, we don't want to, you've been studying this, so you're ahead of the curve on this topic than I am, and I'm not going to try to pretend I know something that I don't know.
That's okay.
We usually set policy in the education committee. We are not setting the budgets.
Right. And then what the budget committee does is they say, we set budgets, we don't set policy, and tuition and fees is kind of a policy thing. And so everyone goes back, and we're the same conversation we have about the social justice stuff that we've complained about. And you will say, well, that's a budget thing, and the budget folks will say that's a policy thing. I guess I'd throw it out back to you is, should the colleges and universities be in the social justice business?
Well, I don't think they should, and I don't think we should. In other words, I mean, each of us individually.
Are you concerned about the approach that the universities are taking to Black Lives Matters and some of these other very leftist institutions here in Idaho?
Yeah.
What can the state of Idaho, the legislature, do about it?
Well, in some respects, I don't know a simple answer to that. I know that for you, everything is so black and white. Just do this, just do it. Who cares what the
we have
consequences
policy
are?
solutions, and so therefore we'd like you to implement them.
Right, I understand that. Yours are very black and white. I'm not happy with some of the things that I see going on in education. I do believe that our youth are being indoctrinated into things that don't sit right with me, with my basic values and philosophies of life. And things like Black Lives Matters. I think one of the things that, and I don't know how you control this, I'd have to do some research, but a lot of it has to be done by the fees that are collected and put and managed by the student governments.
Yep.
And that's where things can really go wrong in a lot of this stuff, because they're the ones that start saying, oh, well, you can have this speaker and not this speaker, or if you bring in this speaker, we're not going to give a discount on the rooms or whatever.
You're talking about the fees paid by students.
Yeah,
so in other words, I'm a student at Boise State University, and whether I want to or not, I have to fund the Inclusive Student Excellence Council, which then voted to oust their president because he had the temerity to say things like, I support the police.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that specific case. I know some of the things around that subject, but the point is that And I've said to one of your staff members that maybe we should be following more like when I can remember when I first got my first professional job out of college. I remember my manager came up and he says, our bank has 100% participation in United Way. It actually wasn't United Way, but if I said the name of the group, you wouldn't know. And I don't even remember. I think I know what it is. And I said, really? I said, oh, okay. So I looked at it and I started looking at their things. And what I determined was, I know there was an entity in there that refused my grandmother to go there to get help when she had cancer. And so I did not want money to go there. Well, I had the option of selecting within that organization where I wanted my money to go. And maybe when they do the student fees, they should have some basic small amount for administration, and then all the other things, I don't want my money to go this, I want it to go that. I think that would be an interesting way. So if they have different blocks, it's like the check off on your tax returns. You say, I want, of my $100, I want $20 to go to this one, none to go to this one, I want $40 to go to this one.
We could do that here. That would be really cool.
Yeah.
But then you still have this administrative problem, which is why did the University of Idaho get rid of professors, but they kept open the LGBTQ office, which I bet you did. Did you know there was an LGBTQ office on the University of Idaho campus?
Well,
or the Gender Equity Center is still open at Boise State, but they complain they don't have enough money, and so they've got to raise student fees. And it just seems like there's a disconnect there, or maybe there's not a disconnect, but actually their priorities are a little different from maybe the legislatures.
I understand.
Do you think there's going to be held an accounting for that?
Maybe. All I can tell you is what my personal emotions are about that and the things that I don't like. And to try and find simple solutions isn't you just walk in and tell me, this is what you're going to do, Chairman Clow. And that's sometimes what it sounds like.
Has that ever worked?
Huh?
Has that ever worked?
Not that approach.
Okay, yeah. But
I mean, if there are things that I already understand, and let's take school choice. I think I've been very much online with that. But if you come and say it has to be this school choice program, I may say I want to find out what most of the people want. And how do we get there efficiently and
no? And I don't know that I'm telling you that I hope you impose a particular solution with regard to universities in Idaho, but is the legislature merely powerless? That's the other thing, is that to me is a bigger thing, where every year the university presidents come in, they give a presentation, you guys listen to the presentation, everyone applauds politely, and we move about our business. Is it the belief of the legislature that whatever happens on campus is really more or less a function of the university presidents and maybe the State Board of Education, maybe to a lesser degree the governor, and you don't have the ability to say anything about the social justice, indoctrination, and various other things that we tend to complain about?
Hey, you want to end on that note? Because I
just
really
wonder what your answer is. I don't know.
Well, I don't know if there is a simple answer, so I can't really give you an answer. How do you deal with that? Other than I think that the challenge has been, and it starts way back, that the challenge is that the leadership of an organization is influenced by the people they serve. The people they serve are the students, and the students, so we need, in some respects, to make sure that we can get down to the students, and some of the problems could be solved by working from the student level. And I would give you an example. In Twin Falls, I've been wanting to get a Young Republicans college thing at the campus.
It's
been
CSI.
hard. It's CSI. It's been hard. But I've reached out to some very conservative people that are in the Young Republicans and College Republicans at Boise State, asking them to come down and help, and they never came down. So it's like, I need to know what you expect, and let's get a club started. Let's get an organization. And I didn't get any help there either. So it's frustrating to try and come up with simple solutions. And society isn't as simple and black and white as it's made out to be.
But I just to wrap up on this, you at least have the ability to ask questions about it. You and your committee, the Senate committee has the ability to ask questions. The Budget Committee. Is this something that the legislature is interested in learning more about and finding out what's happening?
I think when they come, our committee meetings, all of our members are asking these types of questions on the social justice things. I've heard some questions asked of them, but how you turn the ship, how do you turn the battleship quickly? And that's what's a challenge. And there's so many layers of liberal influence within the schools and higher education that it is hard to make those changes. We know that. I know at Boise State they're outspoken conservatives, but they're not that many, right? And from the leadership on down, they've all been brought up in this, and it's become more far left, if you want to call it that, more socialist leaning throughout history, and all the universities are suffering this, and Boise State's not alone, or University of Idaho. We see less of it in maybe some of the smaller schools, and maybe that's because they're closer to all the students.
But so is the answer just to fund them and hope that it doesn't get any worse, or is it? I mean, it sounds to me as if maybe this is the year to have that discussion, but maybe.
Yeah. I voted against all the budgets last year in higher ed until it got to the one that finally approved. So, to send a message, and I've done that before.
Did they get it? Did they get the message?
I don't know how much of a message they got. There's at least a willingness to keep tuition and fees the same.
A willingness. Well, that's something. Well, listen, we're out of time, but I really appreciate you coming on the program. We could talk about education all day, and I'm sure we'll have another opportunity to do it again. So thank you for coming over.
But I do all day.
That is what you do all day because you're the chairman of the House Education Committee.
But I do have other committees, and they take their time too, and I got to get back to one.
Thank you very much for being here, and thanks for tuning in. We'll be back again with another guest, hopefully very soon, so stay tuned.
Okay.
You've been listening to the Hoff Time Report with Wayne Hoffman. Be sure to visit idahofreedom.org for Wayne's articles, IFF research, and show notes from today's episode.